All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Tanil. I'm the Community Engagement Director at HA, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our final Zoom series for the year in our very successful weekly series that we've been carrying on all year and will definitely be continuing next year. We're very privileged today for our topic, Israel, the media and fake news. We have Danny Seaman, and I'll let David introduce him a bit later. But just to remind you a little bit of housekeeping, if you have any questions, you can go to the reaction button and click raise hand, or you can type it in the chat and we'll come around to Q&A later in the session. So again, thank you to everyone who's supported us, who's joined us every week over the past year. It's been a privilege to have you all, and we hope you enjoy this session.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanil. And I think we're all aware that Israel actually fights a war on multiple fronts, and one of those is public relations and the media. And that's what we're looking at tonight. Danny's a distinguished Israeli political commentator and media analyst. He's had over 30 years experience in the Israeli government itself, and perhaps the most relevant appointment is that from the year 2000 to 2010, he was director of the government press office, which is part of the office of the Prime Minister and involved in the coordination of the foreign media in Israel. He's also author of a book on the subject, perhaps the definitive book on the subject, titled Israel and the Foreign Media. So it's not an interview tonight, it's a presentation. So we'll hand over to Daniel Seaman and look forward to your briefing, Daniel.
Thank you, and thank you for all being awake and up at this hour to join in. Actually, it's convenient for me because I do these things with American audiences, and it's usually 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning our time. But that's because we're here in Israel. But I'm more than really honored to have the opportunity. As I mentioned while we were talking before, I don't think any of you have been following things for years. I don't think anything I'm going to say here will be a surprise, or it's not going to. The general things aren't going to be a surprise. So I go into any details, and I once said that if Israelis knew what I knew about the foreign press and how they cover Israel here, they'd be rioting in the streets. Following the events in the last month, almost 3 months now, 2.5 months, a lot of the things that we've encountered over and over again in the many years of coverage of Israel are back in the spotlight. And all I have to say is the hospital incident. You mentioned before the talk about this church that was attacked. First off, we don't attack churches. We know that the churches are being used by Christians in Gaza as a place of refuge, and they certainly are not involved, to the best of our knowledge. They're not involved in any activities while we have questions towards anybody on the Muslim side, whether it be journalists, doctors, as we discovered yesterday, and we knew this before, but now the evidence is being provided, evidence which will always be challenged and denied as Israeli propaganda. But all these issues are there. Somebody who wants to find the facts can find them. And it's one thing when individuals and people, the average persons, choose to believe in this or that. It's much more, I think it's really horrific when it is done by those who are the fourth estate in a democratic society. I'm not talking about Russian media or Arabic media, I'm talking about Western media. And when these bodies that are supposed to provide us, the people, with the information, with the details, with the ability to reach, let's say, educated understandings of situations that we're following, when they fail to do that, and it's one thing failing because everybody can fail here and there, but when it's done malignant in a deliberate way, when it's done maliciously, we have a big problem. I just want to give to start out with a survey of how Israel has been covered. We celebrated, now it seems like generations ago, everything, at least here in Israel, pre-October 7th is so long ago. The world changed on that day, but while we changed, perhaps, the world has remained the same, as we shall see. But it was the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel, of the creation of the State of Israel. And if we just look at how Israel was covered initially, back in the 40s, there weren't a lot of foreign press here. And in the initial stages, we were like the darlings of the world, to some degree. I'm not saying it's as absolute, but certainly to some degree, we were the darlings. It was this very magical thing of the return of the Jewish people to its ancient homeland, certainly after the horrors of the Holocaust. There was Hollywood involved in creating this impression of the Jews that with movies of those of you who probably here could remember, such as Exodus, To Cast a Giant Shadow, these things that showed about the Jewish spirit and the heroism of Israel. There was this impression that there was also a socialist society here, which helped in certain international circles. This fact that we had these communities and the kibbutzim, as we called them, and we were all sitting around the fires and at night and singing Kumbaya, my Lord. I don't know if that was exactly what was going on. I wasn't born there, but this was sort of the impression that they got of Israel. It certainly helped us a lot when we were the David versus Goliath, and that's where it comes down to when media coverage is very simplistic terms. And in 1967, this was just 19 years after the creation of the state, we faced the entire Arab world against us, and we came out victorious in no less than 6 days. And we were the darlings of the world once again, and especially in the United States, where people, even in the United States, did not support us from 1956 to 1967. The United States wasn't our biggest supporter around that time, but so they love a winner. And here Israel was the ultimate winner. We had Moshe Dayan, which is an interesting character that people adopted and took in. And we could do no wrong at that stage. Here we were, a country defending itself, facing unbelievable odds, going through years of terrorism. Sounds familiar. Nothing changes. And this lasted even until 73, a few years later. There was the 73 war where Israel was attacked, this time October 6th. And we were able to come out of this also victorious. But around that time is when you started having criticisms against Israel. I think I'm making this very quickly to get to the points and where we are today. I think things started to change a few years later when you had a change in government here in Israel, and you had a right-wing, or as Time magazine at the time called it, a right-wing extremist government under the terrorist Menachem Begin, whose name rhymes with Fagin. Those of you who may remember, they actually said that. But they're not anti-Semitic, of course. And so there started this legitimate criticism of Israel, and not to no less degree because it was also legitimized by elements here in Israel. And that allowed that to happen. But then Israel went to another war. Again, after being in countless attacks. Around that time, I was in the military myself. I was a paratrooper in the IDF, went through several operations in South Lebanon all through the 80s, the late 70s and early 80s. And in 82, was involved in the war in Lebanon after Israel was attacked the day before. Our ambassador was an attempt to assassinate our ambassador in London, which is by all means an act of war. And then we had missiles launched against us by the PLO in Lebanon at that time, and we went to war against them. And there was where you said that you had the first time where these stories were being sent out against Israel, where you started having these lies spread against things and actions taken about by Israel. I won't go into the details of this because I'm just putting it into a broader category. Following the war, you had years of Israel presence there, and you had a growth of, and suddenly the Arabs shifted, and this occurred already in the mid-60s, even before the Six-Day War, but they shifted attention away from the Arab-Israeli conflict to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is quite interesting. My mom was born in Jerusalem, and she was considered by everybody a Palestinian, she was Jewish. The Arabs never considered themselves Palestinian. That was an insult to them. They were either South Syrians or Bedouin or etc. None of them would have accepted the word or the term Palestinian. I know that in 1964, around the time or just after the creation of the PLO, they had met a person named Abu Yad, the right-hand man of Yasser Arafat, met in North Vietnam, but not only with the Vietnamese, but some American Jews, by the way, very interesting, who were Marxists who had assisted the North Vietnamese in their propaganda against the United States. And they recommended them to shift the conversation, to put themselves in the position of the underdog, which is their biggest problem, as they say, and concentrate now on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, where Israel is the country, and obviously after winning the war in Six-Day Wars, and then in Yom Kippur, we were this military might, and they were the poor underdog refugees, etc. The only people around the world that are refugees in their own country. You're in Australia and Melbourne, and something happens, and you have to go to Sydney. You're not a refugee. You're displaced, perhaps, but not a refugee. But they still gave all those, and this goes back also to 1948 in the United Nations, the recognition, making the exception of the Arabs. No consideration and no recognition of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries, but the Arabs themselves were considered refugees for generations to come. Never applied to any other people but them. Again, international law, and again, talking about anti-Semitism, one of the elements of anti-Semitism has always been throughout history that there are laws, and then there are laws and how they're applied to Jews everywhere, even in democratic and Western liberal societies. Same thing happened here. There are UN laws and the way they are applied to Jews and the state of Israel, which is the representative of the Jewish people. So you go back to the 80s and the terrorism there, and then you had the first, as they called it, Intifada. And again, the underdog Arabs facing the Israelis, a lot of reports there of things and supposed war crimes created by Israel. And let's be honest, I'm not saying that Israel is beyond making mistakes. And there were mistakes made. Every country, every democratic country, in a military conflict, there are mistakes. As I mentioned before, I was in the war in Lebanon. Our first, in the paratrooper 890th Battalion, our first casualties in the Lebanon War were taken in the town of Damour by our own Air Force. We were hit by our own Air Force on the day after we moved into Damour, and we had 7 soldiers in our unit killed by our own Air Force. So these things happen. It wasn't the only incident in that war, but I know of that because I was personally there. So these things happen. But again, laws are applied, and whereas other countries can have these mistakes done by their militaries, Israel's the only one held to task for such events. And I mention these because you see that there are certain things building and developing here. But perhaps the biggest shift began in 1993 with the advent of the Oslo Accords, with all the other problems of it. The other thing is that it gave legitimacy to the Arab narrative or the Palestinian, so-called Palestinian narrative. And this is where it comes in with the involvement of the press. If until 67, 73 perhaps, Israel was the darling, they were covering from an Israeli standpoint of the return of the Jewish people, etc. With 1993, and I would say it started earlier with Arafat and them joining him in Lebanon, in Beirut, and becoming friends with him, but us giving legitimacy to them and bringing them into Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip and making them accessible to the media. You had a technical event of them being embedded in Arab society. And I use the term embedding, which was used a year or two earlier during the Gulf War, where the Americans, who encountered difficulties with the media during the Vietnam War, they decided to embed forces with American troops in Iraq at the time. And what they learned was that it gives the journalists inside information, of course, but it also does another thing. These are no longer the faceless, nameless soldiers that they don't have an affiliation to. They're now sitting with them and having food and going through their events with them. And these are now Billy Bob and Mary Jane, and they know them, they know their families, and it becomes more personal. The same sort of thing happened here in Judea and Samaria when the story shifted from the return of the Jewish people, as I mentioned before, to the land of Israel. Suddenly you now have the Palestinian issue, and them building a country, and all these wonderful things that we were promised in the Oslo Accords that were immediately violated. But the press, instead of reporting truthfully about it, they were going along with the narrative, very much as many people in the Israeli government did at that time. And the narrative was the peace, and ignoring a lot what was going on. Not that they didn't know about it, and I can testify to this as being a member of the Israeli government at that time. I was a spokesman, and I said, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe there is a chance for peace. Maybe Imagine is a true story by John Lennon, and we can all live together in peace and love, and these things are true. But within a year, and very quickly, you see that this was not what was happening. They were deceiving us, and they were very open and honest about what they were going to do. Yasser Arafat said in South Africa a few months afterwards exactly what his plan is and how they're deceiving us. And this was brought to the attention of journalists and also to members of the government. But they choose not only to ignore it, but to apply our own feelings and attitudes and values to them, to the other side. And thinking, oh, if we just continue, they have to be that way, but they're not really like that. I left government at that time at the Prime Minister's office because I couldn't defend that. I went with the IDF spokesman at that time, and during that period, participated with the IDF spokesman in covering these events and allowing access to media and seeing and talking to PLO members that came in. And to them, they weren't on the same page. To them, this was part of their struggle against the people of Israel. And as you introduce this to the media, they're ignoring it. So you had them on one hand ignoring the facts, but on the other hand, this embedding in Palestine, hanging out with them, being with them. On the one hand, it creates that familiarity and, in a sense, a condescending Western attitude. Because if you say, I'll just use something and exaggerate it a little just to make the point. Let's say they're at this, being hosted at somebody's home, and the women there, they're supposed to be seen and not heard, and they just give the food. And you can literally, and I've encountered stories like this. And, oh, so what? His wife was there and she treated us. And, what about, women's rights and the fact, why is she just serving you and not being, all these important values of Western society? No, they find it very charming, these elements of the Islamic society, and they don't judge it according to the standards, not only that they hold themselves, but which they apply to Israel, for example. And this is on a small issue. So you can imagine how things went and grow, how they applied their value system. But you also had another thing, and this is very important because this was not brought to the public's attention. The Arab society, whether it's in Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, certainly under terrorist authorities, is not democratic. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they're not democratic. You don't have freedom, and I'm being very sarcastic for those who aren't aware of it. They do not allow people to roam freely. They do not give access, certainly not to journalists, absolutely not to foreigners. And when you have a terrorist society, they made sure that every journalist around there is assigned somebody who's working with them, not just the average Mohammed who's hanging out and needs a job. Mohammed answers to somebody, and Ahmed answers to somebody. And they all have who to respond to and let them know what is going on. Now, as things escalated with us, and I'm jumping forward to the first intifada, or the first war that we conducted in Judea and Samaria, this occurred as they accused Ariel Sharon for going to the Temple Mount and visiting there. But if you look at the incidents happening the few days afterwards, it's no different than other, when you look at the amount of incidents going on in Judea and Samaria, very similar to other events when the Arabs were unhappy about something. And they're very often unhappy about things, to say the least. So that wasn't, as the media claimed, this was Israel's fault. The real incident, or the real intifada, began certainly being prepared months in advance. And here I found out later that the Shin Bet knew about this, that they were planning to erupt in violence against Israel. They delayed it until, this was already in April. It was delayed knowing that they will be meeting in Camp David with Ehud Barak. Arafat denied all the offers that Ehud Barak made to them, and he was very generous in trying to allow them to create a state. None of that mattered. They were planning somewhere around September to go to war against Israel. And this happened, but they then accused it for being the Al-Dura case. If you're familiar with that, it's the incident of a boy standing behind a barrel, and it was claimed, you never see this on film, claimed that Israel murdered him and killed him, and he was shot by soldiers. Very long story short, this was a modern blood libel. No Western media were present on location at that time. There were only Arab journalists employed by the foreign press. They provided footage of what was going on. I know that one journalist from CNN refused to receive it because he upheld certain values, and he said, there's no evidence to verify what he's saying, that Israelis shot and killed the boy. But Charles Andelaine, who was the correspondent for France 2, the French television station, who was not on the scene, he took it and he swore to the fact that this is truthful. And he was also, being Israeli and a Jew, he did reserve duty with the IDF spokesman, training officers in the IDF for media appearances. So his word was word accepted. And he calls in the IDF that day and telling him, listen, don't deny this. You're responsible for it. And here starts another one of the problems that we have, the fact that the Israelis are gullible enough and don't always stand up for the facts. And this started a whole incident. And this blood libel is what really erupted the violence in the territories and started the Oslo War, or the Intifada, as they call it. And here you had the incidents of the sheer terrible it's not misunderstanding, but the deliberate misrepresentation of what was going on by the media. These same media that for years had to walk around with, first off, they don't speak the language, but even if they did speak the language, they had to have people being around with them. They had to employ Arab cameramen. They had to have them with them. And the more you go into this, as I did at the time, you find out that there are political affiliations. Many of them had been members of the PLO in their respective countries before. Many of them were ideologically in line with the PLO, either Marxist or Leninist, etc. Doesn't mean a lot, but when you see that they have this support for them. And as I said, because the story became the Palestinian issue, they needed to be on their side and needed to roam around there. And if you weren't supportive of them 100%, you wouldn't be able to roam around. I give you one example of ABC, the United States, which had an argument with the King of Jordan, and they were informed that they have to leave Jordan immediately because they could not accept them being there. And this was Jordan. So you can imagine the things the things happening under the Palestinian Authority, and we're not even talking yet about Hamas and how they run things, or Hezbollah. So you have this development, and this is where you have a lot of these scenes. And if I just jump to what's happening today to put this in the perspective of today, even if we don't say that journalists or media organizations held offices in Israel up until the year 2000, they've been there since the year 2000. There's no denying that. That short history we all remember or are familiar with. They've been covering the events since then. They've known about these incidents. They've known about, and you've had several things in which Israel was accused about. If you go to the war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, there was an incident in the village of Kana, which they claimed that Israel fired at and killed civilians there. And you go and you see that there are bodies already in rigor mortis, which are being dug from under the rubble. How are they in rigor mortis already? And if you don't have to be a doctor to know that that doesn't happen so quickly. But even on the simple aspect of it, and unfortunately on our side, and the weakness on the Israeli side is expecting the journalists to uphold not only professional standards, but to be fair, we're always in a weak position and constantly being apologetic and explaining. The word hasbara in and of itself is a problem because we're always explaining. Nobody else around the world feels it's necessary to explain. Just to give you an example, in the Gulf War, when Israeli journalists went to cover American GIs in some location, and I know this because they turned to me to try to help them, they turned to American GIs and tried to pull the same kind of crap, literally, that they pulled with Israel. And the Americans just tied them up to one of the jeeps and kept them there for 48 hours, gave them water and some bread. And when they got out of it, they wanted us to complain. I said, what do you want us to complain about? This is the way countries act, not the way Israel does. And Israel is always worried about what is everybody going to be saying about us, and how do we have to treat these journalists. You treat them with respect when they behave respectfully. When they don't, you don't give them that kind of respect. And they had a hard time when I treated them that way. When they didn't abide by professional standards, they didn't get the support or the aid they needed. But during this war in Hezbollah at that time, you had Israelis going on and saying, we're so sorry about what happened there. And we didn't even know what happened yet. And I went on and I said this on CNN at the time, that Israel cannot be more responsible for the citizens of Lebanon than the Hezbollah. We don't know where they're firing from. We just know where it's being directed towards, our civilians. And under international law, we are not only permitted, but obligated to defend our citizens. Every country's first obligation is defense of its citizens. And therefore, we are permitted under international law to take out the source, regardless of where it's at. We cannot be more responsible for their lives than they themselves are. And so it's unfortunate that that happened, but they're the ones responsible for it. And surprisingly, to a lot of Israelis, this was accepted as being logical. And so this is addresses another aspect of the way Israel responds to things. And I mentioned that because if you go to the hospital incident, and we've had several of these over the past few years, and when we responded to attacks from, and it's always us responding to attacks from Gaza, there were incidents of us being accused. And after a long investigation, and after it's running around the world blaming Israel, you found out that it wasn't our fault. We didn't do it. Interesting, the same people that are rushed to report that. And I grew up in the town of Ashkelon. My family are still there in Ashkelon. The hospital Barzilai in Ashkelon was hit several times in the last round of violence in this war that erupted October 7th. Within days, the children's division there was hit by direct rocket fire, and nobody talks about it. It may get a mention in the media, but nobody talks about it. So Israel is very quick, always. Now, I'm saying this because, listen, the journalists don't know this. It's not only Israel's responsibility, and we may make mistakes not only in the ground, but also in presenting what is happening there. But the journalists, don't they have a responsibility to first, hold on, listen, they've lied to us, meaning the Arab side have lied to us repeatedly. Let's check this out before we report it. Maybe they should look at the record that these Arabs have, and when they understand, when they know that they're reporters in these areas, and especially when it comes to Gaza, and this goes back 20 years, that every single one of the work journalists employed by foreign press there are members of Hamas. There's no two ways about it. You cannot be in that society with the media without answering to Hamas first and foremost. And you have repeatedly international media organizations pointing the finger at Israel after rounds of violence. And there were 16 rounds of violence in Gaza since the year 2000 and since our withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And in all these times, we were accused of killing journalists, when these journalists are later portrayed by the Islamic Jihad, by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, by the PLO, by the Hamas, of course. They're seen in uniform with weapons, being members of them who were killed. And we inform this and we give this information both to these international organizations and to the media divisions themselves. And they're very quick to tell us, no, they are our employees and they abide by all standards of Western journalism. This goes back 20 years ago when we were telling Reuters, for example, that they have a photographer named Mazen Dana who works with the Hamas in Judea and Samaria, employed by them. He deliberately causes incidents with the IDF. He was not given press credentials by us because we had this information, and they refused, and they continued employing him. A few months into the second Gulf War, I get a request from Reuters that they want to send Mazen Dana to Iraq. And Israelis didn't give him permission because he's a member of Hamas. They didn't want to let him out. And I spoke to the security, the Shin Bet and the Mossad, and I said to them, listen, let him go there. What do we care? Let him be their problem. And who cares about him? So they gave him the permission, and he went to cover events for Reuters in Iraq at that time. A month later, I get a call from Reuters asking for our assistance in allowing them to bring the body of that same Mazen Dana back to Israel because of an incident that occurred with the American forces in Iraq, and he needs to be buried in Israel. Okay, we helped them, and more than happy under those circumstances to be of assistance. and allow them to have him back in Israel to be buried. And by the way, I have no qualms about saying that after October 7th, I don't care anymore. Myself, like many Israelis, our enemies deserve what they get. And in this case, he got what he deserved. And I was more than happy to have them bury him in the town of Hebron. Interesting enough, before the members of Reuters came to the family to see them after the death, they had members of Hamas there. They had the flags of Israel and the United States where the people who came, the mourners, could come in and wipe their feet on. The moment they knew that Reuters were arriving, they took away those flags, but we had that information. Me and my naivety, I felt it important that the American soldiers who had taken the life of Mazen Dana not get in trouble like Israeli soldiers, like it happens to Israeli soldiers. So I called the American military attaché at the embassy in Israel at that time, and just to tell him what we knew about Mazen Dana and to be aware of who this person was and his background. And when I called him, he was very grateful, and he laughed and he said, "Listen, Danny, things don't work with us the way it works with you guys." He was provoking our soldiers. As far as we're concerned, it didn't matter if he had a camera or not. He was a agent provocateur, and we took him out. And there was no two ways about it. And I mentioned this just to understand that their governments know about these things. They're all very familiar with this. It's nothing new, neither to them or to the media organizations. And it's not that they're cowards, but they're deliberate collaborators with terrorists. And as we mentioned earlier, and as we began this, terrorists and their war against the state of Israel. And it's not only the state of Israel. We're on the front line of this. As you can see what is happening, I understand it's also happening in Australia. They're going to the streets. This battle, not only of disinformation, but the deliberate perversion of the values of Western society and being used against us. Israel is only in the front of this battle that you're going to be seeing more and more of. And just as we saw on the October 7th, the fervor and the bloodthirst that they got caught up in. And in many ways, it disrupted their plans, because had it not been for them going into a bloodthirsty frenzy and murdering and raping both men and women, by the way. And I watched a lot of these things live on Arab social media platforms. They were not hiding it. They were sending it out, cheering it, proud of it. And when they got caught up in this thing, they didn't reach. They were going for Ashkelon. They were going with the boats. They were taken out by the Israeli Navy. But they were trying to get to Israeli cities further into the state of Israel. But that bloodthirst and that excitement of their immediate successes is very similar to what you're seeing right now with the success that they perceive is happening in the streets of Western countries when they're getting this this power surge of feeling that everybody is with them, and then they can literally get away with murder right now. And you can see what is happening with Christmas and the celebrations and their deliberate disruption of this. If we took out a single mosque that we know they were launching missiles from, the international community would be condemning us. But here they're disrupting the celebrations. And I know in the United States, I don't know what's happening in Australia, but I've seen it in the United States, assaulting churches, taking down crosses. And you don't hear a lot of criticism in the media about these things. So I hope I've given you a general picture of all of this. As you mentioned, this is the book that I published. You can see it, to bring it, it's called Israel and the Foreign Media. It's available to universities. They didn't want to, it took a long time to get it published because a lot of the publishing companies felt uncomfortable about publishing these things. Though I provided them with proof and written evidence and everything they needed to verify the things we were talking about, myself and Dr. Ron Schleifer, who gave the academic aspect of it. I eventually said to this, and I don't care, just publish it. Just the outside, the title in which they changed as well. This way I can say I'm an author. But it was important just to have this documented. I wanted the book to be called The Cradle of Fake News, because we're not only the cradle of the monotheistic religions, we're also the cradle of where the Western media failed and became the center of fake news. They didn't like that title, so if you look for an article that I published a few years back, you can get some insights. It's called The Cradle of Fake News. It's published in Midah magazine at that time. So that is basically what the book is about and what we're dealing with today. Is it going to be easy to change it? No, but this is where you come in. And in a moment, I'll be happy to address any questions. But just to you as the public have to be demanding that the media uphold its own standards. They claim to have certain standards that they uphold, but they have to know that people are demanding of this. And also that your friends who are not supporters of Israel, but we usually say that they're 15% around the world support us, Jews and Christians, 35% support them, but there's a large majority who are not really familiar, and they just follow today, unfortunately, a lot with social media, which is very simplistic. But if you take serious people and you give them the simplest of answers, and we don't have to work hard at this, it makes them question. And all we want them to do, and this has been the essence of Judaism forever, ask questions. Let people reach their own conclusions, because when the truth is out there, and all we have to do is point them in the direction. So I'll be more than happy to address any questions you have now.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'll do our 1 minute promo, and then we'll move to some questions for sure. Okay, as we do every week, at the end of this event, please make sure you do something active to support AJA. You can go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can become a supporter. Make sure that you're signed up to the email list, follow AJA's social media. And we have a special thing running at the moment, which is quite heartening. And we don't normally promote online petitions. But last week, the Australian Christian Lobby, which is the largest political Christian organisation in this country, launched a campaign against anti-Semitism. It is very important that we get as many signatures as possible on the online petition, which is part of that campaign. So please note this website, acl.org.au. After the event, sign the online petition and share it to your networks. Now, we don't have an event next week. We'll recommence on the 24th of January next year, and the program will be announced obviously beforehand. This is what Danny's book looks like, Israel and the Foreign Media, and it's available from Cambridge Scholars Publishing. We'll make the link available as well. So I can see we've got a whole bunch of questions, and please can everyone make the questions as brief as possible. No speeches. And David Schulberg, you can unmute, go first, please.
Danny, it is very fantastic to see you online. I want you to mention something about the logo that's emblazoned on your screen, the IDSF. I spoke with Issachar, or didn't speak to him. I heard him on one of your.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if you're seeing this. I don't want to necessarily draw attention to it, but I think somebody, I don't know if it's my computer or somebody seems to be enjoying themselves.
Well, don't you want to
images? I don't know if you're all seeing these images, but
no.
Good. I'm glad.
Who is it? What's the name?
The Happy
I don't see it. They put it on my photographs. I don't know what they're. It's oh, I don't know who this is. From iPhone 12 to everyone. Free Palestine and
no, not no. You mistake. I'm talking about the IDSF.
No. We've got a hacker. Just
yeah.
Okay. Well, boot them out.
No, I'm glad that we're enjoying it.
No, because
they're used to going with sheep, but in this case, I understand that they're not available.
Looks like they've gone. Okay. Just say something about your organisation, Danny.
Oh, I'm sorry, but David was in the middle of a.
That was it. You wanted to just say something about the logo, the IDSF. what it is?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was
That was the question.
caught up in the image, unfortunately. The IDSF is the Israel Defense and Security Forum. It's an organization created by Brigadier General Amir Avivi, it started out as former commanders in the IDF who take a very strong Zionist pro-Israel position, believing that the future of the state of Israel is dependent on a strong, independent state of Israel, fighting for our own battles, not caving into other, I could basically say that not caving into other countries' requirements and leave it at that. But it's resonated very strongly with Israeli citizens here. We've gone from 12,000 military commanders and former officers to nearly 20,000 people that from all ranks of life. They've also added ambassadors and former government officials. And today, for example, we're assisting the IDF in recruiting for these local towns and villages, security platforms. We know that a lot of people are contributing, and by the way, any of you who have done that to the state of Israel, grateful for in any way that you've helped. But knowing that a lot of things are maybe going to waste, because of the access we have and many of our members are just recently retired, so they still are active in reserve duty. Our deputy founder is now the head of the operations in the Gaza Strip, Yaron Buskila. So they still have access to the IDF, and we asked them, what do they need? And they said that all the military needs of the IDF are being supplied by the United States at the moment. They're being very generous. What we do need is to help these local security forms, as we discovered, that are so necessary after the October 7th. So we were able to get $2 million in aid for these and provide them. And we're now helping with the families and also with the return of the communities and with everything that they need around the Gaza Strip, and hopefully in the future with the towns and kibbutzim in the north of Israel. So those are our activities at the moment. So you can check in with the little thing here. And if you want to assist us with our activities, you're more than welcome to. I don't mean in any way to take away from the AJA support in that, but thank you for giving me the opportunity. And hopefully Amir will be available to you next month and in the new year to provide you with insights. And we are expanding our connection with Australia. I deal more with our outreach to the evangelical community, but I know that those who are responsible for our relations with the Jewish communities are working now for expanding our connections with Australia. And Amir may actually be in Australia in the upcoming year. And hopefully you'll get to see him in person.
Wonderful. Alan Friedman, if you can unmute, please.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks, Danny. A little bit more of a war-related question. The world is calling for, quote, a more humanitarian approach from Israel. And I had a thought, and I wondered if people in Israel are talking about this. And it involves, several weeks ago, the IDF encouraged Gazans to move from the north to the south so that Hamas could be fought. And now Israel seems to needs to deal with Hamas in the south. So I wonder if Israel is actually suggesting to all those people that are in the south to now go back to the north so that Israel can finish the job there. And that would, I think that would probably convey some sort of humanitarian sort of situation. Has that been discussed at all?
Well, I have to admit, I don't know. I'm not involved with government. I'm not connected in that way. I have years of experience upon which I can make assumptions. My response to this can be two things. One, I can tell from what you understand from the Israeli public here. As I mentioned before, we are less inclined to be merciful right now. What we understand now, it's a battle of us or them. And in this case, with all due respect to everybody around the world, we've learned, unfortunately, throughout history that we're the only ones who can take care of ourselves. And as a family, has my family who live in Ashkelon, and we talk a lot about the fact we have hostages right now, but the south of Israel has been held hostage for over 25 years. My nieces and nephews all suffer from PTSD. Now they're parents, and this is the first round in which their 1-year-old, 2-year-old children, my mother's grandchildren, are now suffering from PTSD as well. So we now have second generation of children suffering from that. No country in the world tolerate that. And therefore, we're no longer going to be tolerating that. And the southern communities in Israel are no longer going to be held hostage by Hamas or any Arab in that, for that matter, from Gaza or in the towns and villages that are not only physically, but also held hostage through threats and violence. This is no longer going to occur. And if there's any government who thinks that they're going to allow that to happen, that government will be replaced. But now for the real things that are happening, there is an effort on the part of the Americans and the Europeans to perhaps not force Israel, but nudge Israel into a way. I can just say this. There are things that are being said officially, and there are things that are being said behind the scenes, or the things that are happening in reality. In the Gaza Strip, you will see in the upcoming weeks, as we begin to move away from areas, any of you familiar, if you've driven in the south of Israel, and you've gone, say, if I go from Jerusalem to Ashkelon, either through Kiryat Gat or through Kiryat Malachi, certainly if you go through Sderot to the direction of Ashkelon, you can see the towns and villages, the towns and the buildings and the apartment buildings towering from Gaza in the background. It's only like 20 minutes away from Ashkelon, but you can see in the horizon, you can see it there. If you go there today, you don't see it. They're not there anymore. They've been taken down completely. They're down to rubble. They will not be allowed back in that area. It is not clear whether or not they will be bound back into the Gaza city anymore. To be honest with you, I am not sure that they will be allowed anywhere in Gaza. There's still so much that was going to happen. There's still much uncertainty. What we can deal with is the certainties. The certainty is that the Israeli public will no longer tolerate that. The other certainty is that over the years, you've had over 250,000 Gazans leaving the Gaza Strip. They don't want to be there anymore. And this is when Gaza was, and I'm sure many of you have seen the heaven that Gaza was in the footage, this so-called prison, open-air prison that they showed us how wonderful it was before Israel supposedly destroyed it, which we did. But we destroyed it not because we wanted to, but because it was a heaven above and underneath was hell. And that hell was trying to take us out. And it no longer exists. So neither heaven nor hell exists there anymore. What exists there is the Israeli forces. And we're fighting the devil in Gaza. And that's the way we see it. So we have to take in consideration the interest, it's not only the interest, but the request of the international community. But the government of Israel failed in its first responsibility, which is the protection of the citizens of the state of Israel. Its second responsibility is never again. And this never again is going to happen in that sense that we've seen what they intend to do. They're not hiding it. The Palestinian Authority are saying the same things. There are other alternatives. The two-state solution is over. The Oslo process is over. Those things I can tell you definitely as an Israeli citizen and from talking with the Israelis here. Now, if the politicians are smart, they'll listen, and I do believe Netanyahu is listening. I believe, knowing Netanyahu for over 30 years personally, I know that he is very aware of his position and where he stands in the history of the Jewish people, and he understands perhaps more than any other person the historic meaning of what is happening today and how this has to follow through on this. And that means we cannot give in to international pressure in anything that will threaten and endanger the state of Israel and its citizens. Yes.
Robert Reuven, if you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. Two questions. First of all, I noticed that the Al Jazeera backed off a bit. Do you think it's because of the Qatar's mediation? That's the first question. Second question is, there's a lot of quote from the Hamas, what is it, health ministry or health department giving all the figures. We know it's all false. It just continues. Not only that, I've personally been receiving in Arabic, which I can't understand it, but videos of the terrorists in Gaza using RPGs to hit our troops. Heaven knows where it comes from. Have you heard about this? Have you seen this at all?
First off, Al Jazeera, which I've had a personal relationship with for many years. I honestly don't understand why they're still here. Al Jazeera should be outlawed throughout the Western world. In Arab countries, they are outlawed. They are the propaganda branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they exploit the values of Western societies against them. They should not be in the state of Israel. But it's not enough just to close them down, because Al Jazeera reported from Israel before they had an office here, and that was the time when I was the director. And at that time, they used a Palestinian production company. And I told them that if you want us to recognize and give you press credentials, you have to open offices and do everything we require every other organization here. To their credit, and around that time, they were trying to be a legitimate media organization, and they did open up offices in Israel and perform here in a professional manner. But slowly, within about 2 years afterwards, we learned that the Muslim Brotherhood had taken over the offices, at least of the Arabic branch. At the same time, they were developing an English branch of Al Jazeera. And the same correspondent who had been and behaved so professionally at the time for CNN, he became one of the chief members of the Al Jazeera English branch. So I give this man a lot of respect. I don't want to say his name, not to put him into difficulties with his colleagues. He was of Lebanese descent, by the way, and but an American. And he came when we were giving them difficulties to Al Jazeera because of things that they were doing. One of them, for example, celebrating the birthday of a terrorist who was involved in an attack in Nahariya, in which the terrorist himself bashed the head of a 2-year-old baby across the rocks of the beach in Nahariya back in the 70s. He was released from Israeli prison. Samir Kuntar was his name. He was later taken out by the IDF, but before that, his release was celebrated in the Al Jazeera offices in Beirut. And at that point, we refused to cooperate and work with them in any way. But he came to Israel, the chief of there, and he admitted to me that they are being threatened and their arms are being twisted by the Muslim Brotherhood. They're trying to do their best to maintain the professional standards, but he said he doesn't believe that they can hold on for much longer. And shortly afterwards, he left, and but many of the foreign press continue to be employed by them because they pay very nicely. So they're being paid by terrorists, and something that's even worse. It's an anti-Western ideology which seeks the destruction of all other civilizations outside of Islam, and they're not shy about it. So we have to remember that that's what Al Jazeera is about. And so the problem I say here, it's not enough closing them. You have to make it illegal for anybody, including Reuters and AP and the satellite offices here, or anybody on TikTok or the social media, to provide materials to Al Jazeera by the threat of a legal threat. Will the government do it? They haven't even kicked them out of here, so I'm not too optimistic about that. Your other question, remind me? You're on mute. I can't hear you.
We'll need to move on to some other people. Actually, Robert, you can unmute again. Try once more. No.
Okay. The second question
Yes,
is
I hear
about
you.
The terrorists videoing themselves
Yes.
firing RPGs at Israeli troops in Gaza, and we start everything in Arabic. Heaven knows where this comes from. It cannot even understand it. Have you heard of this? Have you seen this?
Yes, of course. We get these reports daily. There is no more Hamas health ministry. Those officials have been taken out. They don't exist anymore. It's UNRWA and the United Nations providing these kind of informations, and again, from information they're getting from Hamas members. Again, nothing there, including the UN, operates without the permission of Hamas. And as a good journalist that you may be familiar with, he writes for the Jerusalem Post, and he told me, Danny, the fact that you take away our press credentials, it doesn't affect anybody who's not behaving according to professional standards. They don't care about Israel. The biggest thing you can threaten us is taking away press credentials. He says, I don't know who'll be waiting for me in my kitchen when I get home in the evening and threatening my life and my family's life. And that, unfortunately, has a greater effect on journalists. And we know that to happen. It's not only those who join them ideologically, there are also those who are threatened, and they don't mention these threats. They don't bring that to your attention. So those are the problems here. So yes, they talk about these things, but look, we have, not that it's going to change the opinions of those who are anti-Israeli. You have the doctor who admitted to being in a hospital there just yesterday. My problem is, why is he alive? I don't care what he has to say. I don't need to see it, but there are those who believe in the propaganda war, that we have to make these things available. But they never hid this stuff. It's all there. This is a person who not only violated an oath, it's a person who should be killed for who knows what he did in his years of being a Hamas member. But that's a whole different story right now. Could go on to other questions.
All right, we've got two last questions we're going to try to get through if they're brief. Jeff, you're next. Jeff, can you unmute?
I've made it, I think.
Yep. Okay, very quickly.
Shalom. Given Caroline Glick disclosed a few weeks ago that there was treachery from within the army, Israeli Defense Forces, Netanyahu was kept away from that information. Do you think Netanyahu will survive, given that it's fair that he does, for the simple reason that members of the army reacted and behaved in a highly treacherous way?
Look, it's clear that something went horribly wrong on October 7th. There are a lot of reasons for it. I'm not one of those who tends to point fingers at the moment. I certainly, like a lot of Israelis, believe in two things: that this has to be investigated thoroughly, but this will be investigated after we finish. Right now, it has to be absolutely clear. We're in an existential moment, and there's no way to exaggerate that. And it's not an immediate existential moment. If this does not turn out the way it is needed to turn out, Israel will not last much longer. And that pertains also to the international pressure, et cetera, why we cannot give in to it. The horrors of October 7th were not only the horrors. We lost not only that battle on that day, but in the historical view of things, it is an encouragement to all those seeking the destruction of the state of Israel on the Islamic side. This will go down currently, and I mentioned currently, this will go down in the lore of Arab and Islamic heroism, and will encourage generations of Muslims to continue. Currently, unless we extract a price that they will never forget, and one that they will look back on, and anybody mentioning again the possibility of doing something to Israel, their neighbors will take them out. Their neighbors will rather have the conflict with these organizations and not suffer the wrath of the Jewish people. There is no way, and in no terms, that I can describe what exactly we have to do in order to make this right. And when the world understood in the past that to make things right, they needed to drop atomic bombs, I'm not saying we drop atomic bombs, but I'm saying we have to do things in order to protect not only our children, but the future generation and the safety of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. We have no other place. We have no other place. You today, unlike our grandparents and our ancestors, you all know that if things go, and unfortunately our history has taught us, everywhere it eventually goes wrong for us, for the Jewish people. Everywhere. It could be hundreds of years. I remind you that I believe in Poland, we were over 1,000 years in Poland. It didn't matter. History caught up with us. Our fate caught up with us, however you want to call it. But unlike our founding father, our ancestors, we had our founding fathers and mothers. My grandfather came here from Afghanistan 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, because the Geulah began. I'm not religious, but I can't argue with the prophecies that they believed in. And it proved itself eventually. But now we have where to go if things turn wrong, except here in Israel. We have nowhere to go from here. nowhere to go from here. So we have to do what is ever necessary to maintain our existence here. And that means we're going to have to be ruthless when it comes to Gaza. Not merciless, but ruthless. And if the other side understands it, then they're going to, then when we finish with this, and we may have to get involved with Hezbollah as well before that, only then can we address the issues and find out what really happened here. And by the way, I don't trust the media. I don't trust any of our politicians. I don't trust the government to address this in the proper way. I do trust the Israeli people, and I do trust, unfortunately, the pain of the Israeli families who paid the ultimate price on October 7th. And I first and foremost, I direct it to the parents of those young women who were murdered on the first day, on the bases, on the soldiers who were there and sacrificed their lives for all of us. And we're standing behind them. And they will demand to know the truth because we deserve the truth. Every single one of us in Israel, the Israeli citizens have to know the truth, and whoever was responsible, whoever failed to do their job at whatever level it was, will pay a price. So I don't prophesize. I don't say what will happen with the future of Netanyahu or anybody else for that matter, but I do know there is a tectonic shift in Israel. I do know that there is a flood of change before us, but only after we finish with the battle that we are dealing with at the moment.
Okay. Look, we are a bit over time, so Tennille, if you'd like to close things out, I'll just put the links up in the chat.
Just allow me that you can share my email address. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to contact me
Good idea.
by email, and I'll do my best to get back to you. If there are quite a few, it'll take me time, but I do get back to everybody.
Thank you. Well, a big thank you from all of us to you, Daniel Seaman. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. And as you mentioned, if you'd like to get in contact with Daniel, you can email us and we will pass on Daniel's details to you. And you'll have a long list of questions to get back to, I'm sure of. So thank you everyone for joining us. This has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please share this with your friends, your family. It's been an incredible discussion, insightful evening, and these are things that everyone must hear. So please get on, share the link, share this around. For anything else, we'll continue to be active on our Facebook page, Instagram page, newsletters. And while we will be closing for a couple of weeks, the Zoom sessions, we are kicking back sort of mid-late January. So keep an eye out on all our publications for who our next speaker will be and what our next event will be. So from all of us at AJA, we wish you the best. We thank you for an incredible year that we've had together. And we cannot wait to see you back online 2024, bigger, stronger. I'm Israel Chai. Good evening, everybody.